Us today. My name is Jackie Hefner from Pacific Northwest Publishing, and I am here with Jessica Sprick from Safe and Civil Schools for today's webinar on reducing chronic absenteeism. Before we get Jessica started, I have just a couple of quick details to review. You can submit questions in the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. Please send them to both the host and the presenters so that we can keep track of them and help Jessica review them at the end of the webinar if there's time. If she runs short on time, she has agreed that she will answer those questions, and we can send that information out in email to you when we send the link for the webinar. If you're having technical troubles, please send your questions to me as the host, and I will do what I can to help you from here. We do find occasionally with our webinars that some folks have trouble with the audio broadcast. If lots of people in your school are using the internet all at one time, or if a classroom jumps on computers in the lab, there can be some fluctuations there. Let us know, and we can send you instructions to call in by phone if this is the case. One more note, we are recording the webinar, and we'll send a link out later this week for you to review at your convenience or to share with other team members. All that said, let's go ahead and turn things over to Jessica if she's ready.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining me today. We are talking about reducing chronic absenteeism, and my name is Jessica Sprick. I work for Safe and Civil Schools. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I know that that's oftentimes difficult to do, and I'm guessing we're going to have a lot of folks who are watching the recorded version of this webinar later. So for those of you who are watching this at a later time, thank you for taking time at your convenience to view the webinar. I am absolutely thrilled to be doing this webinar today because the topic of chronic absenteeism has rapidly become one of the things that I, as a consultant, am absolutely most passionate about. I've had the wonderful good fortune over the last several years at Safe and Civil Schools to become sort of the lead trainer on working with schools and districts to try and reduce the problem of absenteeism in their schools. And I've just been wonderfully fortunate to see how much progress can be made with this issue when people are willing to put in some of the preventative types of measures that we're going to talk about today, and all of the good intervention and problem-solving type work that needs to happen for individual students. So let me just review what some of our goals are for today and go over a couple of just nuts and bolts details. The first one is, as Jackie said, please feel free to write any questions that you have through the course of the webinar. Jackie will be keeping track of those. And if there's extra time at the end of the session, I'll answer any questions that were typed during the webinar in the order that they came in. If you do submit a question, please reference the slide number or the slide topic if it's in reference to any specific section of the presentation. And if we run out of time for those questions for me to answer them within the 1 hour time frame, I'll actually send out a typed list of the questions and type responses to those, and we'll send it to participants within a day or two of the webinar. The second piece of nuts and bolts information is that we are recording this webinar, so if you have colleagues that you'd like to have view the webinar, or if you have to leave during the course of the hour, we will send out this recording, I believe, within a day or two to all folks who have signed up. And it'll also be available through the Pacific Northwest Publishing website. We have an archived webinar section on the website, so please feel free to view it or send out information to colleagues at that site. And we'll also send out the slides that I'm covering when we send out the recording link. So our goals for today, my hope is that by the end of this hour, that you'll leave with a solid understanding of how to effectively monitor attendance data. And this may be something that you're currently doing with high degrees of efficacy, but one of the things that I've found as a consultant in working with schools is that currently there's a metric that is not being monitored in lots and lots of schools and districts, just simply because it's a relatively new metric that we're starting to pay attention to. So I'll talk about that idea of how do we effectively monitor our data. We'll also look at the importance of shifting from what has been a traditional approach to addressing absenteeism, which has primarily been really focused on reactive and punitive types of models, and really trying to figure out how do we shift to what we know works with changing behavior, which is proactive and positive types of approaches to addressing absenteeism. With that, we'll be looking at how can you create some tiered systems to address your absenteeism so that hopefully you are trying to focus a lot on prevention, not just intervention, but that you are using tiered models for providing effective service to the kids as they're moving up in intensity of need. So along with that, as we're looking at tiered systems, I'll be providing you some practical strategies for school-wide and classroom prevention, also looking at how can you provide some early stage intervention for problems that are not as persistent. So when we're just starting to see that a problem is emerging, what kinds of approaches can we use to try and address this at an early stage? And then also with more resistant problems, as we've tried some of these universal prevention procedures and perhaps some early stage interventions, if we are seeing that a student has a more resistant problem, how do we start applying function-based thinking to addressing that issue? So when we're designing intervention plans, how are we really trying to find out what are the contributing factors that are causing the absenteeism and putting effective interventions in place to address those causes? Just one note for folks, because one thing that I have found in working with lots of schools and districts is that oftentimes people tend to approach the issue of absenteeism and they've got certain kiddos in mind. So they may be thinking about the students who are missing 60 days or 80 days or 100 days within their school system. But one of the things that I'm going to be presenting to you today is that it's actually very important that we get ahead of the game much earlier on than that when a student hasn't had such a significant issue with chronic absenteeism. And so I will be talking a lot and really focusing on the idea of how do we put some efforts in place for school-wide and classroom prevention that hopefully are a little bit easier, cheaper, and get us ahead of the game before a student has a truly resistant problem. So the majority of our focus for today's webinar will be on the ideas of how do we put in some universal prevention procedures, largely at school-wide and classroom prevention aspects. So let's start out by looking at some attendance metrics, and I'm going to present to you the two most commonly utilized metrics, and then this new one that is starting to emerge in the research, and I'm very excited. We're starting to see this new metric becoming much more widespread. So the first one that we look at is truancy, and this, just for folks to know, is that truancy does refer specifically to unexcused absences. And so when we talk about truancy courts or we talk about truancy intervention programs, it's typically only triggering for the students who have excessive unexcused absences. And one problem with that is that it's primarily triggering our interventions at middle school and high school, since most elementary schools, when students are absent, it is with parent permission. So truancy is absolutely an important metric to look at, but it's not necessarily capturing the totality of students who might be having problems with attendance. Now, the other commonly used metric, and again, it's a very useful one, is average daily attendance. And average daily attendance refers to a whole school percentage of how many students do we have enrolled in our school, and what is the overall percentage at this point in the school year that students have been attending. So it gives you a real strong and clear view of what's the overall health of our attendance system, but it is a school-wide measure. So what we found in the research is that because it's not looking at the individual students who might be contributing to the absenteeism problems, it can actually significantly mask a major problem within a school with absenteeism. For example, even at 95% average daily attendance, we've found schools that have 20 or even more percent of their students in a highly at-risk category, and that's usually the case if you've got a large number of students who have fairly good attendance and then a large number of students who have problematic attendance. So that is one thing to note, is that average daily attendance can be a little bit problematic if it's the only metric that you're looking at. So now let's talk about this emerging metric. And what I said before is that this is a relatively new metric. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've started having new research that's coming out on this metric of chronic absence. And the definition that's starting to emerge nationwide through the work of lots of schools and districts around the country, as well as Attendance Works, which is one of the leaders in really trying to make this a policy issue, is this idea of chronic absence, and that's when students are missing 10% or more of the school year for any reason. And so rather than just looking at unexcused absences, we're actually looking at any student who has missed 10% or more of the year as a combination of their unexcused absences, their excused absences, and suspension. And one question that I oftentimes get from folks is, why are we including suspension in this data that we're tracking? Because we're the ones sending them home. And it really goes to this piece right here, that if you have a student who's frequently not in school, whether it's the student is skipping school or the parent is excusing them for whatever reason, or we're having to send them home because of behavioral type issues, there are going to be negative consequences and negative effects for that student as well as for our system. So I am very excited because I feel like we are right at a tipping point with chronic absenteeism, where we now have such a wealth of research that is supporting that if a student is missing this amount of school, they are highly at risk of some negative outcomes, and I'm going to be sharing some of those with you. We're starting to see much more movement across the country with schools and districts paying attention to this, and even at the state and federal level, more and more attention going to the idea that we need to start addressing this for our schools. So just to give you a little bit more of a clear sense of what that metric looks like, we are considering that a student is chronically absent if he or she misses 2 days in the first 20 days of school, that's 10%, or if they're missing more than that, 10 days in the first 100 days of school, or 18 days in a total 180-day school year, if that's the calendar that you're operating off of. Now, one of the things that I want us to consider is that if we have a student who misses 2 days in the first 20 days of school, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have a significant problem with absenteeism. So it could be just the case that the student had a flu bug and had to be out for a couple of days, but it is a significant red flag. And so we're really operating from the idea of, let's put in some early intervention and early warning systems where we are looking in the first 20 days of school at who are our students who made that 10% and are in this chronic absence category, because these are students that we're going to need to keep an eye on and try and get ahead of the problem if they continue to have absence issues in, say, the second month of school. So another way to look at this is if a student is averaging 2 days or more a month, he or she is chronically absent. And the reason why I think this is so important to consider is that oftentimes when I'm working with folks, you know, they are coming with that kiddo in mind who's missing 80 days of the school year. And when they start to realize that we're only talking about 2 days a month, it drastically expands the number of students who may be having a problem with chronic absenteeism. So I really strongly encourage you to start looking at this data, and I'm going to share some of the negative effects just to support why we need to be considering chronic absence in our data collection. Let's do a quick little poll here just to give me a sense. I'd like for you, Jackie is going to open up a little questionnaire on your screen, and I'm going to ask the question, what percentage of your student body is chronically absent? And if you're not sure, go ahead and make an estimate, your best guess, considering, like, you know, maybe say up to this point in the school year, if I figure out how many days of school we've had, what is 10% of that? How many students are probably missing that amount? And go ahead and make an estimate or enter it if you know. A, 0 to 5%, B, 5 to 10%, C, 11 to 20%, D, 21 to 30%, and E, 31% or more. And it looks like you've got about 30 more seconds to go ahead and make that estimate, or if you already know this data, go ahead and enter it in, and then we'll go ahead and review what our data is saying. I'm going to keep moving forward in the presentation until we get those results popped up. So Jackie, if you can let me know when those results are available, that would be great.
Yeah, it looks like most of it's in, and so I can just give you that right now.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Jackie.
Holding us off for just a couple seconds. Sometimes technology is more demanding than we are.
Well, and if it pops up and I don't see it, just go ahead and let me know so that I can, okay, let's see, we've got this here. All right, so I'm not sure if you guys can see this graph that popped up, but what I'm seeing here is that 13% of you responded that we think we've got a relatively small problem with this, 0 to 5% of our students. We've got 28% of you who responded that we think we have 5 to 10% of our students in the chronic absence category. We have 18% of you who said 11 to 20% of our students may be chronically absent. 9% said 21 to 30% of our students, and 7% of you said we think we have 31% or more, and we did have 25% of our people who didn't respond to this question. So we're seeing a pretty wide spread here. Again, I do encourage you after this webinar is finished, if this is not data that you're already collecting, go ahead and try and go into your systems and figure out what is the percentage at this point in the school year, because it can be very revealing and very motivating for what level of effort do we need to put into universal prevention, what types of intervention systems might we need to put in place. All right, thank you guys so much for participating in that poll. So now let's look a little bit at what does the research say about the negative effects of chronic absenteeism. So if we're looking at those students who have 10% or more that they're missing during the school year, what are some of the negative effects? And one of the things that I'd really, really like to highlight here is the idea of early intervention. And we're talking about, yes, early in the school year, but also early within students' school experience, because one of the things that I see happening so frequently is that we're trying to provide intervention for absenteeism at middle school and high school when students have already had a problem with this for many, many years, and now there are lots of other associated negative effects, like the student has fallen so far behind academically, now we're having to provide not just absenteeism intervention, but academic intervention as well. And so this data is very important for that, and I actually would like to recommend that this study be something that we be sharing with all kindergarten families who walk through our doors. So this was a recent study that was done in California, and they looked at students who had regular attendance in kindergarten and first grade, and then followed them up to third grade and looked at what percentage of the students were passing their third grade reading test in third grade. And what they found is that students with regular attendance in kinder and first grade had 64% of them were passing the state reading test. And, you know, 64%, we look at that and we go, oh my goodness, that is nowhere near where we want to be. But when I look at this in comparison to the students who were chronically absent in K and 1, it's just absolutely shocking. Here's the data there. For the students who were chronically absent in kindergarten and first grade, only 17% of them were passing the state reading test. Now, that is a very, very drastic difference. And one of the things that I would find very interesting is if we could increase the attendance of our students who are chronically absent, would we see the academic achievement of our other students going up as well, because our teachers wouldn't be having to spend all of their time doing remedial instruction and figuring out absence work for the students who are not there and figuring out how to try and catch them up. So I think that's just a very, very important piece of information that we share with our kindergarten and our first grade families because they haven't developed the habit of school yet. And we want to try and help them understand that our students are learning critical foundational skills in kinder and first grade, both academically but also with social and social emotional skills, that if they're not there consistently, they don't get the regular practice that they need to make the gains that are going to help them be successful long term. All right, looking a little bit further, some of our conservative estimates of how many students are being impacted by this. The research that's come out, and we don't have 100% clear-cut research because not all states are reporting the data on chronic absence, but by our best estimates, we know that every year at least 10% of our kindergarten and first grade students are missing a month or more of school, and in some of the states, like in Oregon, where I'm from, that's actually closer to 20% or maybe even more. And in some individual schools, up to 50% of students can be chronically absent. So this is one of those issues where looking at data, you're going to have to really be deciding what is the magnitude of our problem. And if you're in a school where up to 50% or even 30% of your students are chronically absent, that is going to argue that this is one of the major initiatives that needs to happen in your school, is how do we tackle this issue of chronic absenteeism. All right, now a couple of other pieces of data on the negative effects of chronic absenteeism. Some of the studies have found that by 6th grade, chronic absenteeism is one of the 3 top signs that a student is on a track to drop out from high school, and the other metrics being poor behavior, that was defined as 3 behavioral referrals or more, and failing grades in math and or English. And so what they've found in this research is that if the student has any one of these 3 risk factors, they are highly at risk of dropping out. And if they have multiple factors like chronic absenteeism and poor behavior and or failing grades, they just continue to be even more highly correlated with the risk of dropout. Also looking at high school, the Utah Education Policy Center found that of all of the students in Utah, they looked across all grade levels, 8th through 12th, and they found that students who were chronically absent any individual year between 8th grade and 12th grade were 7.4 times more likely to drop out than students with regular attendance. And for every additional year, so if they were chronically absent 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, that number just got even higher in terms of likelihood of dropping out. And for those of you who work in secondary schools, just look at this little note here that says increasing frequency of absenteeism in high school is a warning sign of dropping out. So that should be something that's being monitored within your systems, is any students who have that increasing frequency, we want to be looking at what types of interventions are needed to try and pull them back into a track of engagement in our school. Just a couple more things to consider are the negative life effects of chronic absenteeism. And this is one of the things that I like to have staff members in schools do some brainstorming on, is what are some of the important life skills that students are missing out on if they're not regularly in school. And oftentimes what staff members will talk to me about is things like they're not developing the social and friendship skills that they might need to be successful. So they may not be learning conflict resolution skills. They may not be learning how to share. They may not be learning how to work in teams. Another major issue is the issue of resilience. So if you have students who are missing school because of anything anxiety related or any sorts of problems in the school system, by staying home, they're never learning some of the self-advocacy skills that they might need. They may never be learning how to stick with something that's difficult, so those issues of resilience. And then also the major factor of dependability. And I like to highlight that just because I really think that we need to be thinking of our school systems of how are they empowering our students to be successful in the world beyond school. And part of that is work. How are we developing employability skills? And, you know, one of the things that I've seen in working with lots of schools is that the high schools are basically saying, you know, our kids who are chronically not attending school are the same ones who are getting fired from jobs for being late, for being absent, for not sticking with things. And so we need to be finding ways to try and build those habits within our school system so our kids can be successful when they exit. Just a couple more negative effects. There is a strong correlation with chronic absenteeism and involvement in the criminal justice system. So Rhode Island actually found that 3/4 of the students in their juvenile justice system were chronically absent in their past. And then there's also lots and lots of research that associates truancy, that unexcused absence, with the likelihood of being arrested, engaging in serious property crimes, and other types of deviancy-type behaviors that will land students in our juvenile justice or our adult justice system. So looking at the extent of this problem, again, we only have an estimate because we're not tracking this data nationwide. I'm hoping that we're moving in the direction of starting to have statewide accountability for tracking this metric. But currently we're estimating that 10 to 15% of our students, which is 5 million to 7.5 million students, are chronically absent each year. And that is just a huge number of students who are not getting the benefit of every everything that our schools have to offer. So when we look at our behavioral as well as our academic systems, if we have 10 to 15% of our students who are absent with this level of frequency, we're very unlikely to be able to be making the progress that we could if we could get our students in school regularly. And again, in some schools, up to 50% of our students are chronically absent. And another thing to note is that the best predictor of chronic absence is if a student is living in a situation of poverty. Those students, economically disadvantaged students, are the ones who have the greatest barriers that make attendance more difficult. They oftentimes have the least history of success within the education system, within their family structures. So the importance of attendance or the habit of attendance may not be built up in the family. And so chronic absenteeism is most prevalent for students who are economically disadvantaged. And as we're continuing to look at how do we try and increase equity within our schools, how do we increase the ability to get out of these cycles of generational poverty, I think attendance is one of the things that we need to be looking at most strongly. So now we move into what is the goal and how do we actually achieve it. So the rest of this webinar really is going to be focused on what practical solutions can you put in place to achieve this goal that I have here, which is the idea that every student will regularly attend school. And I really want to try and create that shift in mindset where we put aside all of the potential barriers, all of the potential excuses or reasons why a student might not be able to attend, things like parents are just not doing their job, or the student just doesn't value school, and some of these value-laden statements, and really just go to this mindset that every student can regularly attend school, and we can do everything in our power to try and make that happen. Now, what does that mean? Regular satisfactory attendance, if we're looking at the research, basically means students who are missing 5% or less of school in an academic year. And the criterion for that 5% or less is basically saying that if a student has missed that amount, 5% or less in the academic year, they are highly unlikely to be exhibiting some of those negative effects that we just talked about related to their attendance. Now, they may have other issues that are causing disengagement or problems with academic achievement or any of those other negative effects, but it's highly unlikely that it's the attendance that's causing that problem. So what does that mean? If we are looking at the standard 180-day school year, that means the goal is that every student is missing 9 days or fewer. It's a pretty lofty goal, right? And let's take this back to averages. That's no more than 1 day per month on average. So again, we may have a student who at the start of the school year or sometime during the course of the year develops a flu bug and has to be out of school for 3 days or however many days. And because we're working on averages, what we really just want to be messaging to folks is that's the importance of making sure that whenever the student can be in school, they are in school. So that, hopefully there are several months during the course of the year where the student doesn't have any absences, so that if one of these emergency situations does come up, the student is not going to be significantly adversely affected by their attendance problems. All right, so how do we reach this goal? And again, I think a lot of times I see sort of a deer in the headlights look from folks when I share that goal of no more than 9 days per month, because we have a lot of students who may not be achieving that. But what I want to advocate is that we take what we already know works with changing behavior and let's just apply it to the issue of absenteeism. So we have lots and lots of years in history of research on what works with behavior, so positive behavioral management techniques in schools. That's kind of non-negotiable. It's not a question anymore. We just know it works. Utilizing multi-tiered systems of support is becoming much, much more just not a question in schools, that we're going to utilize our resources in this way. And we do the same thing with academics. So let's apply these same principles to the issue of absenteeism. So that's the idea that we need to move away from our systems that are primarily reactive and focused on punitive measures, because we know in changing behavior, these have a limited effect and may only work with certain students. So let's take a look at what is the traditional approach that many schools have taken across the country in addressing absenteeism. And A lot of schools will implement things like warning letters and perhaps calling meetings with the student and the family members to talk about absence and why this is a problem. Oftentimes they kind of increase in severity or in the message being much more serious, that we're moving towards truancy court, or, you know, if you don't make some changes, then here's the types of things that are going to be implemented. And oftentimes that can kind of just escalate to increased levels of nagging and sort of punitive relationships with our families. In many cases, we may have truancy court type procedures, and I do think truancy courts have their place, and oftentimes they can be very, very useful and functional when they're not completely overloaded. But I've spoken to many, many truancy court officers and people involved in the juvenile justice aspects of our truancy systems who are basically saying we are getting so many students referred to these systems that we can't provide effective intervention because we are so overloaded that we can't actually do any of the good interventions that we know may work with students, and it basically either becomes a slap on the wrist or it's just a monetary fine, which, you know, may or may not make a difference for a family. So truancy court, yes, it probably has its place. Yes, it may be a useful procedure, but I'd like to advocate that we move away from it being our primary or our only procedure that we're using to address absenteeism problems in school. It's really sort of an emergency last-ditch effort. And the last one here, suspension for excessive tardies and absences. Some schools do still do this, and I would advocate if it is something that's utilized in your system, this is pretty much the only thing I'm going to say get rid of, basically because, you know, if a student is frequently absent or frequently tardy, there's usually a reason for it, and it's oftentimes motivated by I have something more reinforcing outside of school that I'm wanting to do, or I'm finding something aversive in the school environment, and so suspending the student is really just reinforcing that behavior. It's sort of giving them the reward that they want, which is not to be in school. I had a sort of revelation example of this when I was speaking to someone from a district in Texas, and they were saying that one of their policies and procedures was when a student reaches a certain level of unexcused absence or a certain level of tardiness, there's an automatic suspension in place. So they basically had a zero tolerance policy for tardies and absences, and she said they had the most awful example where there was a police officer in the community who saw a student who was obviously supposed to be in school, ended up picking the student up and taking the student to the school. The school then looked at the student's absence and tardy record and realized we have to implement our zero tolerance policy and suspend this student. So about 10 minutes after the student had been brought to the school and brought by this police officer, he was now released from the school and went and kind of did a neener to the police officer. Now I have my suspended excused absence here. And so that idea of suspension for excessive tardies and absences, it really just is reinforcing the behavior and continuing to perpetuate some of these problems. So if we are implementing punitive reactive type procedures, we also want to make sure that they're things that are not reinforcing to the student. So let's look at, in order to reach this goal, again, of 5% or less, 9 days or fewer of absence for every student in our school, we really do have to start looking at more of a proactive and preventative model rather than just a reactive and how do we punish kids back into being in school. And the first step of that is to regularly monitor the data and set some priorities based on that data. I'll talk about how to do that in a moment. Be looking at some preventative school-wide measures, and one of the things that I am incredibly excited about is in schools where they have only done these two steps with the monitoring data and setting priorities and looking at school-wide prevention, that universal tier 1 type prevention, they've been able to make some major differences in their data as to how many students are impacted by problematic attendance. So I'll show an example of that in a moment. And then lastly, looking at implementing function-based approaches and research-based interventions for your small groups and your individual students who are continuing to struggle with attendance problems after we've done some of the universal type prevention. All right, so looking at collecting data, we're going to collect and analyze our school-wide absenteeism rates on a regular basis, and this will help us make some decisions about how much emphasis and effort do we need to put into school-wide prevention as compared to really refining our intervention systems. So the data that I would encourage you to look at is what percentage of our students are fitting into this regular attendance category, missing 5% or less of days, what percentage are in what we call the at-risk category, so missing 5.1 to 9.9% of days, what percentage of our students are chronically absent at 10% or more, and then what percentage of students are in the category of severe chronic absence, meaning they're missing 20% or more of days. And that just indicates a level that is so critical for students. We really need to be doing some more intensive problem solving on how do we address this problem. And one of the things that we recommend with this before I move forward is that similar to any of your other types of systems where you're trying to monitor student progress, that this be done on an ongoing basis. And so we recommend that if you have existing positive behavioral intervention support teams or multi-tiered systems of support teams for behavior, that might be a logical place where they're adding this as a metric that they're looking at, perhaps every 2 months or every month they're going to be looking at this data. And it might also be if you're realizing you have a fairly significant problem with this, we're actually creating a specific attendance task force that is another team within our school similar to an attendance or an academic or a behavioral task force to be trying to address this issue. So again, we recommend looking at this data at least every 2 months, if not more. All right, and for collecting data, I'm going to show you a quick sample of how you can do this if your data system doesn't already do it for you. But one of the things that I would recommend is as we're looking at these metrics, it might be worth going to whoever in your district has the best understanding of your data management systems that deal with attendance, because in some cases what I've found is the systems actually can pull this data for you where you just enter, you know, I want to see all the kids that had the 5% or less. I want to see all the kids that had 5.1 to 9.9 and so on. But that's because school personnel didn't know they should be looking at this metric, they don't know that their data system can do it. So it might be worth talking with someone in your district who deals with that technology and perhaps even contacting the data management company. So if you work with a specific company that provides your attendance system, contact them and find out if it's either something that exists within the system or could easily be built, because this will be much easier if your data system can just do this for you. If it can't, here's basically the process of how you would look at this data. You would print, so if we're looking at chronic absence, you would print a list of all of the students who have been absent 10% or more of days in the current school year. Count the number of kids on that list, and then divide it by the number of enrolled students. Very basic procedure. I'll show you an example in a moment. The only problem with this, and this would also be something to look at within your data management systems, is this process doesn't account for students who arrive after day 1 of school, and your students who are highly mobile, your students who are in foster care and are often moving around, or your students who are homeless and maybe sort of in and out of the school system, they're some of the students who are most highly at risk of chronic absence. And so with this procedure that I just showed you here, the problem would be if we have a student who arrives on day 40 of school and we're not individually calculating his or her rate and where they fall within the different absence categories, then they're going to have a skewed piece of data because they're basically going to be calculated according from day 1 of school to the current rather than starting at day 40 or whenever they entered. So be considering how you might do that for your students who are late arrivals in your school. Now here's the example, just a data set to look at. So if we're looking at school-wide percentage, let's say hypothetically I work with 1,500 students and it's day 60 of the school year. So 10% of 60 days would be 6 or more days. So I'm going to print a list of all of the students who have missed 6 days or more at the current time of the school year. And hypothetically, let's say I counted 217 students. So now I'm going to divide 217 by the number of enrolled students, which was 1,500, and that's going to give me the percentage of 14.5. 14.5% of my student body is chronically absent. So again, I would recommend that you do this procedure with all of the students, what percent of our students are in that regular category, at risk, chronic, and severely chronic, and that you're doing this about every 2 months or a little bit more frequently if possible. All right, so then that begs the question, when do we focus on our universal systems as compared to focusing our effort and energy on either small group or individual type intervention systems? And so we're going to look at that collected data to decide how much emphasis do we need to put on this. And most of you have probably seen the sort of tiered triangle, which is looking at if the health of our system is really strong, we should be having about 80% of our students in Tier 1. So that would be the goal of we've got at least 80% of our students that have regular attendance, that 5% or less. That we may have about 15% of our students who are in the yellow zone or at more Tier 2 type of need, and so that might be our students who are in the at-risk category of 5.1 to 9.9%, and that we only have about 5% of our students who have really critical levels of at-risk behavior, in this case, the students who are chronically absent. And just like any of our other systems, anytime we're starting to see too many students in that Tier 2 and Tier 3, so we've got more than 15% and more than 5% in the at-risk and the chronic absence categories, that's going to argue for we need to focus a little bit more on universal prevention. And the reason for this is basically, you know, if I start to see that I have 20% of the students in my school who are chronically absent, I have now just completely overwhelmed any intervention systems that I wanted to put in place. So that's kind of the scenario that I described about the truancy courts, where we have so many students who are getting referred to these truancy courts that they can't provide meaningful intervention. And so often, this is what's happening within our school systems, is we have too many students who are chronically absent, and we can't have our interventionists intervening meaningfully with that number of students. So that's going to argue for, let's look at these universal prevention type procedures. And the amount and intensity of what we're doing at each of these tiers really is going to depend on the severity of the problem. So if you have a relatively minor problem with this, you've only got 3 or 4% of your students in the chronic absence category, that might argue for we really are focusing on what are we doing for those 3 or 4% of students with more intensive intervention procedures. But if we've got more significant numbers of students, you know, what level of effort is going to need to be put in place? And are we going to have to allocate some significant resources and time and energy to addressing absenteeism? Now, just to give you a little bit of hope about the power of this idea of universal prevention, this was a data set from a group of schools that I went and worked with in Michigan, and they had identified that absenteeism was a major problem in their district, and that it was, they were really looking at how do we try and prevent students from ending up in the juvenile justice system, and one of the major efforts that they identified is we need to start getting our kids to be in school regularly. And so they actually started this training with their elementary schools and I believe one middle school. And in looking at this data, I hope that you can see the graph clearly. The blue is basically each blue bar represents one school. So we had 15 schools that participated in the training. And the year prior to the intervention, basically the schools you can see here had anywhere from 20 up to 45% of their students who were chronically absent. So a really fairly severe level of need in these schools as regards absenteeism. And again, this was elementary school and one middle school. And then what we ended up doing is we did a one-day training in the fall of 2014, and it was focused solely on universal prevention. What school-wide efforts can you put in place? What classroom efforts can you put in place to make a difference? And their data towards the middle of the year, during the same time frame as the pre-data, the blue bars, years basically ended up being this, that within about a half a year, they were able to drop the number of chronically absent students down to, it looks like one school is slightly above 5%, but the rest are somewhere between 0 and 5%, simply by implementing universal procedures. So I really want us to encourage people to think that this universal prevention can be so incredibly powerful. Imagine if you were able to reduce the number of students down to that 0 to 5%, and now you start seeing the students who truly have a more resistant problem that requires intervention, rather than a student who just needed a little bit more awareness, or families who needed a little bit more data to support your kid has to be at school regularly, and perhaps a little bit more communication from the school or motivational type strategies to get them there. So, in the majority of our remaining time, let's look at some of those strategies for universal prevention, and then we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about how do we put meaningful intervention systems in place. So in general, what I like to do with universal prevention is to talk about the efforts that we might need to do with our staff, with our students, our families, and potentially with our community. So we basically got 4 major stakeholders that we want to get on board with absenteeism is a problem, and we need to be having students regularly attend. And some of the major things that we can do with each of those stakeholders is awareness building. And as much as we might think that people realize this is important and they know, the data is not supporting that. And also the action that I've seen schools taking, where they're providing a lot more information and resources to families about attendance, is that when we do some significant awareness building, we start to see major changes in student and parent behavior. So this is an area where I think we can do much better in most schools, is in awareness building. Also utilizing some motivational strategies at the school-wide and the classroom level. And then we might also be looking at tailored strategies, looking at what is our data saying are common causes of absenteeism for large numbers of our students, and can we put some tailored universal procedures in place to address those. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And then we can also be looking at long-term policy work to try and change some of our policies around absenteeism, maybe moving away from policies that are only speaking to truancy and now trying to bring in policies that are actually addressing chronic absenteeism and sort of following with where the trend is going with our national research. But another thing, and a reason why I'm not addressing policy too much here, is that I do think that we can provide meaningful action even when our policies are not requiring that of us. So if we recognize that this is a problem for our students, let's go ahead and do the preventative efforts, even if it's not required according to our current policies. So, looking at awareness building, let's start with how do we increase staff awareness. And I really think that this is truly the first step of any type of universal prevention, because our staff members are really going to be the front line. And trying to move away from absenteeism as the purview of one interventionist in our school. So let's say the counselor is supposed to deal with all of the attendance issues in our school, or we have an attendance secretary that's her job to be trying to problem solve and deal with all of the attendance issues, where we're really realizing that it has to be a collective effort. And my father is Randy Sprick. He's one of the leaders in the positive behavioral intervention support and multi-tiered system approaches. And one of the statements that I absolutely love that he makes is that if everyone does a little, no one has to do a lot. And I truly think that with attendance, if we start with increasing staff awareness about the importance of this issue, we can get everyone on our staff so excited and so motivated to do a little bit to tackle this issue that it really reduces the notion that any one person or any set of people in our school system has to do a lot to address this. So one of the procedures that I've found very, very effective in trying to roll this out is basically starting with staff with a brainstorming activity where they're basically taking some time to think about and brainstorm in these categories. What are the negative effects of absenteeism? So let's look at the negative effect on the student, him or herself, inside school. So they'll think about academic effects, they'll think about social effects on that student, and what are also potentially some of the negative effects outside of school. And so oftentimes that leads people to thinking about, increased involvement in delinquent activities, getting further disengaged from the school system, and lots of those other negative impacts on the student. But let's go beyond that. So then we have staff members brainstorm, what are the negative impacts on the classroom as well as the teacher? And so people start brainstorming, the teachers spending all of their prep time dealing with absence work and trying to create homework packets, not able to move instruction forward as well. People start looking at the difficulty of building classroom community, and possibly as they're looking at partner and small group work that, everyone's having to sort of accommodate the student who's frequently missing. So there are many, many negative effects on the classroom and teacher, also on our parents, and then looking even further at our community or our society at large. And one of the things that I think hits home for a lot of people is if we start looking at the data that correlates frequent absenteeism with dropout, now we're starting to see all of the negative societal effects of dropout based on absenteeism. So this is a very useful activity, and what I've found is that even if staff members are a little bit resistant to the idea of now we have to take on one more thing, that when you do this brainstorming activity with staff members, it reduces all resistance to that, because they start to realize that the impact that this is having on our schools is so significant that if we're able to tackle it, we're going to start seeing some major gains in our classroom community, in our ability to provide meaningful instruction, and so on. And so what I've found is that staff members get really excited and empowered about, yes, now we want to do some things to address this. We can also share some of the national data on the outcomes of absenteeism, and that was one of the reasons I shared some of that research with you at the beginning of this presentation, is so that now you've got some resources and some fact sets to be able to share with folks on the reason this is so critical. I also encourage you to look at the Attendance Works website, because they have a wonderful research section that has lots and lots of the emerging research on why this is so important. That could be useful data sets to share with your staff members, but also share your school's data. So what percentage of our students are actually in this category of chronic absence? And I've seen some schools doing some really slick things where, in middle school or high school, they're actually looking at correlations of our students who are chronically absent, what is their average GPA as compared to our students with regular attendance, or what is their statewide passing scores as compared to the kids with regular attendance. So looking at some of those data sets within your own school to empower people and get them excited about trying to tackle the issue of absenteeism. Now, I'm sharing one example with you here. This is Barnes Bears, and the Barnes Bears are in Kelso, Washington. They are an elementary school, and they have 82% of their students on free and reduced lunch. And I've had the privilege to get to know some of the folks on this team over the last couple of years as they've implemented some of the suggestions that I was recommending, and then have seen some amazing successes and have actually gone way above and beyond anything I would have expected from the half-day training that they attended. And one of the first things that they did is that their PBIS team did start with, we need to get our staff members engaged and involved in this process so that it's not just one person or a small team that's tackling attendance. And so Jake Alabiso, who is their school psychologist, shared this with me. He basically said that their PBIS team presented information at a monthly staff meeting, and they were trying to help define the problem and develop a common vocabulary. So after coming to a presentation, their team was like, we need to go and share this with everyone. And what they ended up doing is they spent part of the meeting time to have classroom teachers review their own class's data and sort their students into the three categories of regular attendance, at risk, and chronically absent. And what they found is that with the classroom teachers doing this, their rough data in their school indicated that not even 50% of their students were attending regularly, 50. And this was absolutely shocking to the staff. Jake said this was absolutely mind-blowing, and it inspired the staff to immediate action. And what ended up happening is over the course of the last year, after the staff members were empowered with this data and were like, this is a huge problem, we need to address it, they put in some wonderful universal prevention efforts. And in 1 year, they were able to reduce the chronic absenteeism in their school by 10% and increase regular attendance by 16%. And for those of you who are in states that are funded by average daily attendance, this equated to a 2% increase in their ADA. So they went from like 92.4%, I think, up to 94.4%, and they're continuing to see even greater gains this year. So for those of you who are in states where funding is associated with this, you know that even a 2% increase is a major, major increase in your funding source. And just for those of you who are interested, the most recent issue of Educational Leadership was focused on the importance of data. And Jake and I, along with Kim Yor, who is the principal at Kelso Washington Barnes Elementary School, we co-authored an article that basically takes what are the general steps for prevention and intervention, and how did Barnes apply this at their school. And so we have this article, Dramatically Improving Attendance, that's in the November issue of Educational Leadership. We'll actually send out a link to that article in the follow-up to this presentation when we send out the slides. So if you're interested in seeing some of the specifics of what Barnes did, you can see that there. All right, moving to the next step. So if we're looking at increasing family awareness, we have lots of great examples of things that people have done to try and get families aware of the importance of attendance. On your slides, when you see them, hopefully it'll be a little bit more clear than you're seeing it here. But this is just an example of a letter that might be sent home at the beginning of the year or at the start of your attendance initiative. It basically tries to frame things in a very positive way, that we've learned students who miss even a few days of school each month are at greater risk of academic failure than students who attend regularly. It goes on to say, you know, our goal is that students come every day unless they're seriously ill or have something else going on that requires them to be out of school. And then it includes this chart at the bottom to try and help families keep track of their attendance. And so what you can see is that it's got 9 spaces here. And the idea behind this is that you're trying to create a routine with the families of any time the student is absent, the student is going to write down the absence, the date, and then the reason. And that the goal is by the end of the year, they're going to have no more than 9 days filled out on this chart. And so you can see over at absence 10+, it says your student is at increasing risk for academic difficulty and school failure with each absence beyond this point. And this was a recommendation that I've provided to many, many schools, and I'm starting to see some really neat examples where some schools have actually printed this in the student's planner, so it's at the front of the planner, and anytime a student returns back from an absence, the teachers are having them write down in their planner so that the student is keeping track. I've also seen it in some schools where they have some sort of folder that's like an attendance folder. The student is marking it down in there. And then this is just a wonderful example. It came from a school in Tacoma, Washington, First Creek Middle School, where they actually printed this chart on a refrigerator magnet. So the idea was we're going to send this home to every student, and whenever they have an absence, they're going to go to the refrigerator and try and keep track. And I just love the little note that's right below First Creek Middle School attendance. It says a whole year has 365 days. A school year has only 181 days. That leaves 184 days to spend time for family visits, holidays, shopping, household jobs, and other appointments. And then it gives the green, yellow, and red with the percentage of when students need to be in school. So again, just kind of giving the benefit of the doubt to our families as well as our students that some people are just moving so quickly and have so much going on in their lives that even if they're trying to keep track of number of absences, that something simple like this as a tool can help create that structure and system for them to be able to keep track. I'm going to skip a little bit forward through this, but I'll do a little bit of a write-up for you when I send out the information. Just based on time, I want to make sure to be cognizant of your time. So let me go ahead and move forward to strategies for increasing student awareness. One of the major strategies we recommend is actually teaching the importance of school, and so doing some direct lessons and other types of maybe chants, social stories, routines with students about why attendance is important. And my graph came off of there. So we can also look at motivational strategies, and this is an example of a classroom strategy where each day the classroom teacher would basically count up the number of students in the class, and with the students go to this graph that's probably on a large wall chart or something, and graph the number of students who are in attendance. And simply by doing that, it's just ritualizing that we're paying attention to attendance, we're working together to achieve a goal. And in this case, the teacher actually enhanced that system with a little bit of a structured reinforcement system. So setting a goal of, we had 22 or 23 students attending regularly before this system. We've got 30 students in our class, so let's set a goal of 27. And then what the teacher did is every day that there were 27 or more students in the class, they were earning points towards a mystery motivator, which is basically a mystery reward. There's lots of different possibilities for what the class might earn, from low-cost, no-cost things up to maybe 1 or 2 higher-cost items in terms of time or money. And the teacher, when the students reached 10 days at their goal, would then draw for that reinforcer. So that's an example of a classroom-type motivational strategy. Now, as we look at the idea of tailored strategies, the idea with a tailored strategy is basically that we're looking at the data to say, what are the major causes of absenteeism for large numbers of our students, and let's put some strategies in place to address those issues. So an example here is we worked with a school in Hawaii, and they started looking at their data and actually found that one of the major times when students were missing was the first month of school, and it was largely related to student immunizations, that students who had not gotten their immunizations yet couldn't attend school until the school had a record of it. And so what they ended up doing is in the month prior to school starting, they actually had the school nurse and the school counselors start contacting families to get those medical records in place and to start facilitating any families that were having trouble figuring out how they were going to get the immunizations or how they were going to get transportation or any of these issues, starting to try and facilitate getting those students the immunizations before the start of school. And they were able to drastically increase the attendance starting in September because they took this tailored approach. Another example, and this is very common actually around certain times of year in different types of communities. Working with some schools in Montana, they found that lots of students were missing really, really frequently around hunting season because it was just family ritual that, we're going to go out and we're all going to hunt together. And so one school took the approach of let's increase our messaging and let's really try and hype the importance of school, let's increase some motivational systems, let's try and talk to selected family members about why school, why your kid has to be there regularly. And they were able to reduce the problem fairly significantly. But if you look at the second bullet, another school took the data and they decided to take a different approach where they were basically saying, this is a very important time for our families where, it's really a bonding time for them, and it may be the only time where the kids are getting that meaningful time with dad or whoever they're going out with. So they basically ended up taking the data on the extent of the problem. They ended up recommending to their board, let's actually make a week-long fall break that starts at the beginning of hunting season and encourage all of our families to hunt during that time, so it's basically excused during that time, and let's make our summer a little bit shorter. And they were able to significantly reduce their problem. So you can see this idea of taking that tailored data and applying some tailored approaches can be very effective. All right, and moving forward, let's go ahead and look a little bit at the early stage in the function-based intervention. I've got about 4 more slides left, so if you need to exit, we've probably got about 5 more minutes of content, but you can feel free to review the information after the presentation when we send out the recording. So with early stage intervention, we're looking at trying to provide intervention really at those earliest stages of the problem. So looking at, again, students who have had 2 days of absence in the first 20 days of school, let's not wait until they've had 10 or 15 absences before we start trying to provide some meaningful intervention. And what we recommend is that those initial contacts really are starting out with very welcoming and supportive contacts, hopefully from classroom teachers, if the classroom teachers are willing, and in some schools they've actually implemented a policy where teachers are making the first phone call home, and just expressing, we're missing your student at school, we really hope everything's going okay, and can we help problem solve any issues? And then be thinking about how do we intensify as the level of need is getting increased. So we might also look at some additional motivational strategies, or looking at those universal strategies if we haven't done a lot of teaching, or we haven't done a lot of family awareness, or talking to community members who might be able to support this student. What are some things we could put in place to improve attendance? And an example of a motivational strategy that might do that is something called a group contingency intervention. And with this intervention, basically the procedure is you create a small group of students, ideally with a few students who have some attendance problems, but also with a few students who have no attendance problems, so kids who are very consistently at school and maybe just want to be a part of this group and benefit from a little bit of extra reinforcement. And on Friday of each week, this group would get together at the start of school, and you would basically draw a number from a set of 10 numbers, and I'll send out procedures for this. But basically on sets of note cards or some other small type of card, you would print the numbers 5, 5, 5, 4, 4, 4, 3, 3, 2, and 1. And notice there's more of the 5s and the 4s and fewer of the 3s, 2s, and 1s. And the idea is that on Friday, when that group is meeting together, you would draw from this bag of 10 note cards, and whatever number is drawn, any students in the group who had that number of days present at school or more is going to get some sort of group reward. So for example, if you drew the number 3, any student in your group who had 3, 4, or 5 days of attendance that week would then be able to earn the group reward. So it's really just, it's working off of odds. They're more likely to get it if they're present more days of school. But even if they only attended that one day on Friday to get the reward, there's still a chance that they may earn it. So we can look at some early type interventions like this with small groups. And then, as we're looking at more resistant problems, we want to be thinking about applying a function-based approach. And what I mean by that is basically the idea that we're going to look at what are the causes for the individual student. And typically these break down into 4 categories. We've got barriers. What are some things that are preventing the student from being able to come to school? It could be things like transportation. It could be chronic illness, any other types of barriers that are actually preventing attendance. We might also have a category of the student or the family not understanding the importance of attendance or hasn't bought into the importance of attendance, and that's a separate set of functions that we might need to address. We may also have students who are escaping or avoiding something in school, and things like anxiety issues, bullying issues, conflict with peers or teachers, or academic deficits would fit within this category of escape or avoidance. And the last is students who are getting something outside of school that they find reinforcing. So sort of the prime example of that is the student who would rather go and hang out with a gang rather than being in school where they're having struggles and not having a strong peer group. So looking at what are those functions, and for many kids it's sort of a multitude of those functions, and that our intervention plans are really designed around addressing what need do we need to meet for the student, or how do we address that function within our intervention plan. Just as we wrap up looking at a couple of additional tools and strategies, we do have a functional behavior assessment resource that was written by Dr. Bill Jensen, Randy Sprick, myself, and several co-authors that is assessment materials that will help you with individual students actually assessing what are the causes of absenteeism. And then we also have a book that comes with the FBA kit but can also be sold separately. That's 25 small group and individual interventions for absenteeism and truancy, as well as 5 universal procedures. And so those are resources that you can find at www.pacificnwpublish.com. I do also highly recommend that you view the resources that are available free at attendanceworks.org. They are truly one of the policy leaders in this fight to address chronic absenteeism. They are absolutely wonderful in looking at the research and trying to provide tools and strategies for schools in how to address this. We do have one upcoming webinar that I'd like to mention to you guys, and it looks like my slide got deleted, some of the text. So looking at this next webinar, it's for First Step Next, and this is for anyone that has problematic student behavior with individual students at pre-K, K1, and grade 2. It's a very strongly research-based intervention. It was developed by Dr. Hill Walker and several co-authors, looking at students who struggle with following directions, working independently, cooperating with others, and emotional self-regulation. So we will be providing another free webinar on First Step Next, and that will be taking place on, if I can get this to work, Tuesday, December 1st, again at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And you can sign up at pacificnwpublish.com. And my last little piece here is that if you're interested in more information or training support on the absenteeism content that I talked to you about today, in any of the following areas, looking at universal prevention, function-based intervention, or training for like your school psychologists in intensive FBA for absenteeism issues, or simply looking at technical assistance for your school or your district and looking at the data and trying to develop a plan for addressing absenteeism, please feel free to contact us at Safe and Civil Schools. You'll see the number there, and that will be included in the slides that are sent out. And I just want to thank you so much for your time. I know that your time is incredibly valuable, and the fact that you were willing. We had over 100 people who stayed with us for this slightly more than an hour during your busy day, and I'm sure we'll have more people viewing the webinar after the fact. I just truly appreciate that people are viewing this as an important issue to take the time. I hope that you found some of these strategies and techniques useful to you, and wish you the best of luck in all of your efforts to try and support student attendance. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jessica, for taking your time today to share this important information with our webinar attendees. And thanks again to all of you who joined us today. We appreciate your taking time out of your busy day to take in this information. Jessica mentioned our upcoming First Step Next webinar, but I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention you can access recordings of several of our other webinars by visiting the archived webinars page on the Pacific Northwest Publishing website. We've got 8 or 9 webinars there covering various subjects that might be of interest to you. That said, I'm going to leave this Q&A box open for a minute or so before we close out in case anybody has any questions they'd like to send. Jessica will send responses out in the email that we'll get to you in a couple days with the link and the recording information. And then on behalf of all of us here at Pacific Northwest Publishing and Safe and Civil Schools, we appreciate all you do to support the staff and students in your district or your school. And we hope you all have a lovely Thanksgiving holiday. We will send out, there's a query about the PowerPoint. We will send out the PowerPoint slides along with the link to the recording. All right, I think we're going to just wrap it up, and we appreciate your time. Thanks.